Welcome to the Dead Man Talking Halloween special. I am your host, Dead by Dalen. Happy Halloween to all you nightmares out there. To celebrate the occasion, we'll be doing a 2-hour segment tonight. Due to the first snowfall of the school year hitting our campus recently, we'll be starting off with some colder stories for you to warm up to the show with. So, sit down, cuddle up with a warm blanket, and constantly look over your shoulder in anxiety-fueled fear. Cue the music.
Tragedy has struck the Grand Valley area as the bodies of two college students were found dead at the KMSA State College's main campus. Police have yet to identify the two students due to horrible. This is truly a sad day for us at Mesa State. Police are issuing an emergency permit. Persons involved are captured. I repeat, the murderer is still at large, highly likely armed.
How'd that get in there? Anyway, cue the music for real. To start off the show, I thought we'd try something a little different. Each week, we will be reading a new chapter from a chilling story taking place right in our home of Colorado. First hour, first chapter. My Romantic Cabin Getaway by Felix Blackwell. My fiancée and I are from California, but her family lives in Colorado, and they own a cabin near Pikes Peak, way up in the mountains. After visiting them, they recommended we go stay at the cabin a few days. We are avid hikers and jumped at the opportunity. Colorado is very rich in Native American folk legend. Virtually every place you go used to belong to an indigenous community, and the few of them who remain keep the traditions and stories alive. Pikes Peak is no different. There are enough stories and gift shops to give anybody the sense that the land itself is alive. I don't know if this has anything to do with what is happening, but maybe someone here is from Colorado and could help us connect the dots. Faye and I are currently at the cabin. It's day 4, and we were planning on leaving today, but things have gotten very strange around here. We have enough food for a winter, and the heater is in stellar order, but the Wi-Fi is terrible at best, and there's virtually no cell reception. We feel isolated. I will try to respond to comments, but the internet dips out for hours at a time up here. The first weird thing that happened was the snow. There was no snow in the forecast, so we packed light. But on the first night here, just our luck, a blizzard pounded the whole area. My little Corolla is basically a brick of ice outside, and there's no way I'm going to try to make the 6-mile drive down the mountain to town. I blame myself for trusting Colorado in spring. After a day, Thursday, of lovely hiking and sightseeing, some really unsettling stuff started happening. When we returned to the cabin, just before dusk, we found an enormous dream catcher dangling from a tree about a dozen yards from the back door. And this wasn't the kind you're imagining either, the kind you buy from a novelty shop. This thing was made from twigs and twine, and it's about 3 feet in diameter. Absolutely humongous. Neither Faye nor I were stupid enough to touch it. We're veteran horror movie fans, and we know that's how you get cursed. If the snow melts a bit, I'll get back out there and snap a picture of it and post it here. That night, while we were eating dinner, we heard a bunch of noises in the woods outside. Twigs crunching, leaves rustling, etc. This isn't unusual because we saw some elk and deer on our hike, but the sounds were slow and purposeful. They stopped and started and were rhythmic, like someone was casing the area in a crescent shape around the cabin. I used my really bright tactical flashlight to look outside from the porch, but there was nothing. We stayed in all day on Friday, just cuddled and hung out and played some of the board games we brought and some of the Super Nintendo games they had in the cabin. Donkey Kong Country 2 I've considered stealing because it is the greatest game ever made. It snowed again, and after dark, we started hearing more noises. Around 1 a.m., Faye woke me up and told me that she was hearing a voice outside. I strained to listen and thought I could make out the sound of a man crying very far away. But his voice was drowned out by the wind, so I wasn't absolutely certain of what I heard. We went back to sleep, but again, around 4:45 a.m., we heard him more distinctly and closer. He sounded like he was calling for help, but he would dip into another language that I've never heard before. We called the ranger station at the bottom of the hill using my cell phone, and they told us they'd get up here and check it out. We never saw them, and I doubt they ever came. On Saturday, things got really scary. It snowed again in the morning, and I stopped getting service for most of the day. Faye and I watched movies and tried to Skype with her family, but that didn't work. She went to sleep early, around 8, while I did some photo editing on my laptop in the living room. She woke up crying hysterically. When I asked her what was wrong, she said she'd had a dream that she was lost in the woods outside and something was following her. I cuddled with her until she fell back asleep, and eventually, I drifted off too. Faye woke me up around 1 a.m. She was absolutely beside herself. I've never seen her so afraid in my life, and just the look on her face really unsettled me. She told me that she heard the man outside again, but she recognized the voice. She was absolutely convinced that it was her grandfather's voice, and that he was wandering around outside begging for help. Faye's grandpa died when we were seniors in college 4 years ago. I told her that she was dreaming, but then I heard the voice too. I never met the guy, so I wouldn't recognize his voice, but it did sound different from the night before. It sounded older. I had to do everything I could to keep her from running off into the woods looking for him. Eventually, she realized that the possibility of it being him was absurd. So we put a movie on at a good volume and fell back asleep. My cell phone wouldn't connect a single call. What happened last night, Sunday, was the thing that has sent me over the edge. Essentially, the same thing happened. Around 1 a.m., at which point I was still awake, almost expecting the noise to happen, I heard a voice. This time, it was a woman's. Thankfully, it was distant enough that it didn't wake Faye. I walked into the bathroom and cracked the window open just a tiny bit. The frosty air that came through that crack seemed like a death sentence to me as a Californian. Nobody could survive outside for long in that, not without serious military-grade winter gear. And yet, someone was wandering around out there, stepping on twigs and crying. I am a reasonable, skeptical, sometimes arrogant agnost, but I'm telling you, the voice sounded exactly like my mother's. My mom is alive and well and living in Southern California, so my brain instantly cramped at the sound of her voice out here in the Rocky Mountains. I would know my mother's voice anywhere. I think we all would. And I'm telling you, I'm about 90% sure it was hers, which is way too short to not scare the life out of me. I grabbed my light and went outside with the blanket wrapped around me and my hiking boots on. I circled the entire cabin and looked around. There was snow pushed out of the way in a big, meandering pattern that snaked in and out of the tree line, like someone was drunkenly shuffling around. Maybe they were injured. The path went right up to the bathroom window and then back into the woods. Each time the voice called out, I shouted, "Mom?" Or, "Who's there?" Or, "Who are you?" And each time, the voice receded further into the woods. I'm pretty certain it was trying to coax me deeper and deeper into the forest, away from the cabin. I'm still alive because I'm not an idiot. I'm not gonna die like some dummy in a bad horror movie. I went back inside and made sure we were locked down tight. And since I can't call the ranger station, I'm posting this instead. I'll keep you updated. Edit. It's Monday, and we got a hold of Faye's dad. The weather is supposed to clear up tomorrow, so he's going to come pick us up in his truck and help get my car down the mountain. I will keep you all informed. Only one more night in this place, and I'll try to get some photos up. Edit. 9:30 p.m., Monday. I've been able to get online twice today. I wish I knew more about electronics, but I'm a history teacher. So I don't think I can fix the Wi-Fi or predict when it'll work. I can send and receive emails and some Reddit posts, but I cannot load some websites or view photos. Faye hasn't been feeling well since noon. She developed a stomach ache and has been intermittently throwing up. We both ate the same thing and I feel fine, so I'm not sure what it is. She sometimes gets like this when she gets worked up. Although I'm an agnost and atheist, she is very Catholic and is pretty convinced that something supernatural is going on. No need for alarm at the moment. She does not have a fever and I'm keeping her hydrated and in high spirits. She seems to be on the mend. Went to sleep about 1.5 hours ago. Some noises to report. Cackling and repetitive vocalizations in the forest, probably 100 yards out. The tree line starts at about 20 yards out, so the sound is coming from much deeper. Some movement spotted just behind the tree line at dusk, but could be elk, deer, etc. Couldn't see very much. Keeping all the curtains closed, windows locked, furniture in front of the door, and I'm checking on Faye every half hour. Her dad will be here in the late morning to pick us up and dig my car out. Another Redditor near us pointed out that I'm an idiot for not double-checking the weather. You are correct. I promise I'll provide an update as a new post tomorrow, should anything significant happen. The Basement by M.J. Ors.
Growing up, my parents told me never to go into the basement. It is kind of interesting now that I think back on it. I was an obedient kid and never did anything that my parents told me not to. But I also never once questioned, until very recently, why I wasn't allowed to go down those stairs. Our house was huge. My dad worked in finance, but grew up a country boy before college. So, as soon as we had the chance, he moved us out into isolation. Even though this made his commute over an hour into town, I loved it. Especially when I was younger, because we had lots of animals on our property. Some wild and some actually owned by my parents. My mom would stay home and take care of the chickens and the geese while I watched and played with them. My mom would always tell me not to get too close with the animals because we would sell some of them from time to time and she didn't want my feelings to get hurt. I did my best to follow her instructions, but I have to admit, there were definitely some animals I missed when they got sold off. I spent many evenings after the long bus ride home from school, sitting out back with the animals, watching the sun go down over the wide open fields. It was more peaceful than words could describe. But of anywhere on the acres and acres of property, the only place I wasn't allowed to be was that basement. I once tried to walk down with my mom when she went downstairs to do the laundry. I offered to hold the basket of dirty clothes for her as she went down the steps, thinking that she would definitely appreciate the help. But I was terribly wrong. As soon as my foot hit that top step behind her, and before I could squeak out my offer to assist her, she turned around and pushed me back using the laundry basket. Not a hard push, but enough of one to force me back through the door and into the kitchen. "What have I told you?" she said to me. "What have I said about coming down here?" I apologized and hung my head, feeling like a bad kid. She could sense that and patted me on the head. "It's okay," she said. "Just don't do that again. You need to stay up here. Why don't you go see if any of the chickens have laid eggs? I forgot to go out this morning and I would love the help." I smiled and agreed to do it, walking out the back kitchen door towards the coop, my mom closing the basement door behind her before I even made it outside. The weather was terrible a few winters ago. We were pummeled by the snow and, unfortunately, a lot of the animals died on the farm. Don't get me wrong, we were okay and everything. Again, farming was more of a hobby than a means of income or survival. But I was pretty upset by the animals no longer being there. For some reason, my parents got jittery and seemed to be more and more out of character the longer we were forced to be in the house. We had plenty of food and our power hadn't gone out, so I couldn't figure out what it was that they were freaking out over, besides being stuck and not being able to go outside. There was a knock at the door a week or two into the snowstorm, and I remember how strange it was that we would have a visitor. We never had visitors. We were pretty far out into the sticks, and people didn't want to swing by or anything, especially without letting us know first. My dad answered the door, and there was a young man, lacking all color and covered head to toe in white, thick snow. He thanked my father graciously for opening the door and explained his situation. His car had broken down about 6 or 7 miles up the road, and he didn't know where to go. He didn't have a cell phone, and he was traveling across the country, so he didn't know who he would have contacted anyway. My father invited him in, and all of a sudden, that jittery sense about my parents started to float away. They seemed more calm now that this stranger was in the house, and it was such a peculiar situation that I just had to sit back and watch. I listened to this man tell us that he didn't have any family living except a sister that he hadn't spoken to in years, and that he was on his way to Boston to start fresh. He said that his mother had passed away only a few months prior and pulled out a tiny gold locket on a chain. He told us that it belonged to her and that it was the only thing that he had left of her. I smiled and nodded at him, still not saying a word. After he spoke for a few minutes, my parents realized that the snow covering his clothing was melting and that everything he had on was soaked. My mother looked at my father and said to the man, "Would you like to change? You and my husband seem to be about the same size. You could borrow some of his clothing for now." My father nodded along. The stranger stood and shook my father's hand, thanking him over and over again while my mom led him towards the kitchen. "Our laundry room is right this way. I'm sure we can find you something." She opened the basement door and gestured the man towards it. Without hesitation, he started down the wooden steps. My father came to me and told me to go upstairs and get ready for dinner. I said okay and walked up the large staircase, not thinking twice about the request. When I came downstairs, my mom and dad were setting the table. I asked if the stranger would be joining us, but without even looking up at me, they said that he had left. I didn't know what to say to that because he had almost frozen to death just getting to the house, and the closest town wasn't for miles and miles. There was no way he would make it back. My parents told me to have a seat and dinner went along like nothing happened. But I finally got curious. This man couldn't have just disappeared into thin air. I had to know what was going on in the basement. I had to know if he ever came back up. I was young, but not stupid. I knew that something was wrong. That night, after my parents had gone to bed, I grabbed the flashlight from my drawer and started down the stairs towards the kitchen. The floors creaked, so I had to really take my time, making sure I didn't wake up my parents in the process. When I finally touched the tile of the kitchen, a small wave of relief came over me, and I took a break to steady my breathing, seeing as how I had been holding my breath as I moved across the hardwood. I finally reached out to the knob on the basement door, checked around me one last time, and opened the door with a creak. I placed my foot on the step, which felt much older than the stairs. The air as I head down smelled sweet, but a foul kind of sweet. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. I came down to the concrete floor and listened the best I could. Silence. Nothing. I flashed the light around to see a washer and dryer, just as I had expected, and some boxes of what I remembered to be old clothes and such, but nothing really out of the ordinary. I was turning to head back up the stairs, now feeling silly and actually pretty sour with myself for not listening to my parents, when something shiny caught my eye. I turned the flashlight on it and walked over to where it lay on the floor. It was the golden locket the stranger had showed us from his mother. I picked it up and leaned myself against the wall to examine it further when the wall started to move with my shifting weight. I jumped back, frightened, and shined my flashlight on the wall, realizing that it was, in fact, fake. Being the curious kid I was, and still clutching the locket, I moved the wooden portion of the wall out of the way, revealing a shallow hole. What I saw in there is something that has changed my life forever. Inside the hole sat a creature. This thing looked like a human, like a boy, but quite different. His limbs were much longer than a regular person, widely disproportionate from his body. At the end of each arm were bony fingers with sharp claws that this thing curled over and over again by its face. Its eyes were pitch black with no pupils. It was a hairless beast, and its ears were simply torn holes in the sides of its head. The mouth stretched across its face into a large, sharp-toothed grin. It had no clothing besides a small cloth covering its lower abdomen. Around its neck was a thick chain attached to the concrete wall. It stared at me, smearing what looked like blood across its wrinkled face, smiling. My foot hit something and I looked down briefly, trying to not take my eyes off of this beast or creature or whatever it was. A hand. Too afraid to scream, I turned and started running towards the stairs. I only took about 3 or 4 steps before crashing into my parents, who stood over me with their arms crossed, shaking their heads. My dad put his arm around my shoulder and led me up the stairs into the living room while my mom covered up the hole. The chickens and animals that I missed were never really sold. My dad didn't grow up on a farm or like living in isolation, but rather felt as though we had to. We had no neighbors for a reason. It was planned that way. Our whole lives up to this point, even now, years later, has revolved around my older brother in the basement and keeping him fed.
When I was little, I didn't talk for a long time. I was sensitive to lights and sounds, so I built secret hiding places where they couldn't get in. Sometimes I do the same things over and over, until one day I found out I had autism. My family got me help. Slowly, I learned how to live with it better.
Early intervention can make a lifetime of difference. Learn the signs at autismspeaks.org/signs. Brought to you by Autism Speaks and the Ad Council.
The bodies of 2 college students have been found dead at the KMSA radio station. The bodies of 2 college students have been found dead at the KMSA.
This article can't be real. I'm here right now. What does it mean the station shut down? It very clearly said... I didn't even know we still had a phone in here. Hello? Do you know what day it is? Who is this? Hello? It's Halloween. Hello? 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 Welcome back. Snow by Anonymous. A beautiful snowfall. The first since Kara had moved into the small, cozy house she had rented. It was in the country and the perfect place to complete her online university classes while also fulfilling her lifelong dream of becoming a starving artist. Starving science fiction writer specifically. The elderly couple she rented it from, whose grandchildren she had babysat, had left the Midwest for a warmer climate after their retirement. They had taken pity on her as they knew that her mother, her only relative, had died of a drug overdose after many years of addiction. They allowed her to stay for next to nothing in exchange for keeping the property in order. For many 20-somethings, living alone in such a big, secluded house would be boring or scary. But for Kara, who had previously only lived in cramped and filthy inner-city apartments, it was absolutely amazing. This is partly why she was so enchanted by the snowfall. Though she liked to fancy herself as a serious and solitary artist, the allure of the snow just drew her in. She bundled up and went outside for a peaceful walk through the beautiful scenery, a huge yard with a barn at one end and a small pond at the other. The quaint view, along with the peaceful silence that only snow can create, put her in a happy mood, and she was feeling very calm and happy by the time she came back to the house. Just as she stepped up onto the first stair leading to the door of the house, a movement in the snow caught the corner of her eye. For a reason she couldn't explain, her heart skipped a beat, and she felt the urge to run inside and lock the door. The feeling only lasted a split second, but it took her a moment to collect herself. She cautiously looked back at what had moved, and that's when she saw it. A tiny, pure white kitten, maybe 2 months old. She had to laugh at herself for being startled by such an innocent little creature. She glanced around for its mother, thinking of all the semi-feral cats living on the property. she didn't remember any of them having kittens. And in this cold weather, they mostly took refuge in the barn or garage. Either way, this kitten was alone and it was less than 30 degrees outside. So she scooped him up and, almost on impulse, decided to keep him. She had never had a pet before and could just picture him curled up beside her as she wrote or studied. The more she thought about it, the more she thought it was a good idea. Fighting the urge to name him after a science fiction character, she settled on the easier to spell Snowy. She was amazed that he wasn't freezing as she wrapped him in a blanket and rummaged through her landlord's cabinets for pet supplies. He must have just left the garage and wandered too far out in the cold. She found some cat food and watered it down for him. To her relief, he scarfed it down gratefully. She carried him through the big house and down to the finished basement where she lived, furnished only with bookshelves of science fiction books, a bed, and a cluttered desk. She thought the presence of a little cat curled up in the corner made it so much homier. All thought of studying or writing was lost for the rest of the day in favor of playing with her new pet. That night, however, she had trouble sleeping. She woke in the middle of the night and had the horrible feeling that someone was watching her. She laid there in silence with her eyes shut, hoping that if she didn't acknowledge the feeling, it would go away. It only got worse, and as the night wore on. Her heart raced and she fought to keep her breath even. Hours later, she finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, but was still relieved when morning rolled around. Though there were no windows in the basement, it was as if a fog was lifted. The entire atmosphere of the room shifted. During the night, the light snowfall had turned into a storm, and the temperature had dropped 20 degrees. Kara had no plans to go anywhere, but the knowledge that she couldn't bothered her more than she expected it to. She tried to write, but she couldn't focus. After struggling for a while, she decided it was useless to continue working and instead curled up with Snowy and sought some peace of mind in her favorite novel. This provided a measure of escape, but when night rolled around, she dreaded getting in bed. She put it off for as long as possible, but eventually, exhaustion won out. She fell asleep easily, but woke up in a few hours, just as before. This night, just as before, she woke up with an uneasy feeling. She was determined not to spend another night as miserable as before, so she forced herself to open her eyes. She slowly turned her head towards the center of the room and saw a pair of bright red eyes staring back. She wanted to scream, but was frozen with fear. Slowly and deliberately, she closed her eyes and opened them again. This time, the eyes she saw were yellow and belonged to little Snowy. What was wrong with her? She still felt frozen with fear. Without thinking, she quietly said, "Snowy?" And the cat immediately ran over and snuggled next to her in bed. She hid her face in his fur and tried to sleep, but couldn't do it. Eventually, she decided that maybe she just needed to get up and out of the basement. She got up, forcing the kitten to jump to the ground, and groped her way down the wall towards the doorknob. Though the room was near pitch black, she kept her eyes shut tightly. She found the door, but as her hands desperately roamed the frame, she didn't feel the knob. She forced herself to open her eyes. The knob was right in front of her. She didn't know how she'd missed it. But now she noticed something. An unnatural red light coming from behind her. Instinctually not wanting to have her back towards the possible threat, she slowly turned around. The light was coming from everywhere, and from nowhere. It simply bathed the room. Snowy had jumped up onto a bookshelf and now jumped down. The shadow cast in the eerie light was not of a cat, however, but of a grotesquely hunched human-like creature. Kara forgot about leaving the room and stumbled backwards. Pressed against the door, she was unable to pull together a complete thought. Terror held her in its grip. All she could do was curl in on herself, close her eyes, and repeat fragmented bits of the Lord's Prayer as the cat slowly and deliberately walked across the room towards her. But it was too late for that nonsense. It left the house only hours later, walking through the frigid temperature on icy roads, possessing Kara's body, and holding a kitten. As the stray kitten had provided a way into Kara's life, the stray girl would surely get through to another soul. It eventually came to another farmhouse, tears in his eyes, to tell a story about a car crash and a walk through the cold. Who could turn down such innocent creatures? Snow Angel by Laser Goose. On a scale of 1 to 10, what's the surest you've ever been at one moment that something absolutely sinister was looking straight at you? I'd rate my experience earlier tonight at about an 8. I was driving home from my parents' house around 10 p.m. They only live about 10 minutes drive from me, but what a difference 10 minutes makes. They're out in the country, no streetlights. It's Michigan in the middle of winter, and I'd make the terrific decision to take a relatively unkept road home. The same road where I collided with a deer not 2 months ago, instantly vaporizing my Christmas fund. It's Deer Central out there. Well, I was headed down this road at about half the speed limit, eyes peeled for some of the four-legged white-tailed terrors, and my eyes were starting to get strained by the headlights of an oncoming vehicle. It was at least a half-mile away, but the high beams were on. I guessed it was a truck, though I didn't want to look too closely and then be blinded to some furry wrecking machine sauntering out in front of me, so I kept my eyes off the side of the road as much as I dared. As I got closer, I realized I was right. It was a pickup truck, but it wasn't heading towards me. It was parked on the shoulder, and the emergency lights were blinking. I slowed down even more, waiting to see the telltale signs of a deer collision: imploded grille, cracked windshield, missing side mirror, and obviously, a deer corpse. Once I was alongside the pickup, I still hadn't seen any damage. Now that I was out of the light's glare, I could see that the truck was pulling a horse trailer. The trailer must have been wired in because the red lights on the back were blinking on and off in time with the emergency lights of the truck. I rolled down my window to talk to whoever was in the cab, but once I looked closer, I realized the truck was empty. "Hello?" I called. No answer. Then I heard the scraping and the thumping. It sounded like someone slamming an upside-down bowl onto a surface repeatedly. It was coming from behind the trailer. I looked out of my windshield and saw a loop of rough rope making a part of a knot around a handle on the back of the trailer. I couldn't see the rest of the rope, but the knot seemed to be sliding up and down the handle a bit. I inched forward in my car, peering around the corner of the trailer. Sudden movement startled me. Then I realized what an idiot I was. The rope led to a harness fastened to a horse. The large, brown creature was scraping and stomping its hooves on the ground, standing close to the ditch, stretching its rope across the back of the trailer. As I pulled up further, it glanced at me, snorted, and went back to stomping. Thinking I was probably irritating it, and knowing there were no other cars for miles, I switched off my headlights. It kept stomping. I looked at the ground around its hooves. The snow was tossed up, and in some spots, the horse had chipped off bits of the dirt shoulder. He'd been out here a while. "Hello?" I called again, fully expecting a response from the dark field on the other side of the ditch. Nothing. I looked at the horse again. Steam shot from its nostrils. Then I looked back at its hooves and the ground around them. I'm not a Boy Scout, but fresh snow makes it fairly easy to piece simple stories together. In the brief, flashing intervals of dim, red light afforded me by the trailer, I was easily able to make out boot prints alongside the trailer, obviously coming from the cab. They turned and led along the back of the trailer, then into the ditch, past the bubble of red light. Then there were the same boot prints coming up from the ditch, accompanied by hoof prints. Presumably this guy's horse had gotten out of his barn or pasture nearby, and he was out here to retrieve it. And that was my Columbo moment. Then there was the whole area in between the horse and the side of the trailer closest to me. I could see the boot prints, but they weren't in a straight line. They seemed to be all over the place, pointing everywhere, like a person jumping around or hopping from one foot to the next. And mixed in with them were other prints. The new prints looked a bit like the inside of a peace sign, a Y with an extra line between the forked lines, about twice their length. There was no real sole or pad, but each toe, if you could call it that, was thick, at least a couple inches wide. And at the end of each toe print, including the long rear protrusion, the handle of the fork, I suppose, the snow seems to have another flaw in it. Not an imprint, really, more like a slit. Like from a claw. These prints were as mixed up as the boot prints were, but tended to stay closer to the road. Whatever made them, the guy wearing the boots would have to get past it to get back to the cab. Out from that mess of prints, both human and, I guess, animal will do, erupted a straight line of boot prints, with long strides heading back along the road, away from the truck and trailer, past the edge of the red light. They continued into the darkness that I knew would be uninterrupted until the first streetlight a mile away. The other prints were mixed in with these ones, weaving in and out of the same line. In other words, following. Their strides were at least as long as the bootman's. I stole one more look at the horse, still clearly agitated, and at the prints right behind the trailer. Now, obviously, snow being white and the trailer's pulsing lights being red, all the snow in the range of the lights was going to be red. But I know it wasn't my imagination that some patches, here and there, were a different shade of red than the rest. And with the dim light and the horse's dark fur, it was hard to be sure, but I thought a few long lines were glistening down the animal's side. I like to think that I'm not a stupid man. I saw no benefit in staying here to play detective. I decided to distance myself from the horse, trailer, truck, and the prints. I flipped my lights on and started rolling away. The horse never stopped staring at me. I swear, it had the closest thing I've ever seen on an animal to the expression of a homeless man who hasn't gotten a penny all day. But as I pulled forward, I just wasn't able to take my eyes off the footprints and whatever prints on the side of the road. About 10 feet past where the red light would have ended, there was another scuffle, both set of prints mashed together, definitely a couple spots of dark pink snow, and then just the boot prints continuing their journey. But off to one side, they'd left behind a much larger imprint, roughly human-sized. There were shapes on both sides of the body. They were wide and somewhat wrinkled, like the imprint of a jacket a child would leave after laying in the snow. They fanned out from the main body, leaving drag marks, like something unfurling. They were also ribbed. I admit I was only viewing this in passing, but I swear I know what I saw. It's hard to describe exactly, but thinking back, I'd say that comparing that shape to a snow angel would seem wrong in more ways than one. I kept moving, picking up just a bit of speed, but I was still going fairly slowly so my tires wouldn't burn out on the snow and ice. I could see the three-toed prints moving from the larger shape back to the chase, just for a few feet, and then they just ended. The boot prints carried on for another 40 feet or so, then they ended too. At this point, I had to stop. I don't mean that I really decided that I wanted to. It's like my brain just needed to verify that I was seeing this right. 2 sets of prints, one human, one not, both just ending. No sign of a change of course or a dive to the ground or anything. Pure, untouched snow on all sides. Well, not totally undisturbed. I think something in my brain was just misfiring at that point, trying to make it all fit, and so I looked back once at the trailer and truck, highlighted in a blinking red aura. I could see the horse, still watching me. And then, in the road ahead of the truck, something shifted. It was the truck's headlights. They bounced. The truck's tailgate also bounced, just a slight dip towards the ground, then back up, like a brief pressure on the suspension. The trailer shifted just a touch. Now the horse wasn't looking at me. It was looking at the black space above the truck and trailer, the spot on the roof of the trailer that no light could ever reach. And it was straining against its rope harder than I've ever seen anything fight in my life. My tires burned out briefly before they found traction. So, that was my 8 moment. I really lost count of how many times on the way home I nearly slid into a ditch. I went sideways once, but I always kept control, using some combination of luck and sheer force of will to not get stranded on the road tonight. Now I'm in my driveway, and I'm wishing my garage door was working. Because right now, I'm having my 10 moment. The porch light is illuminating a portion of the roof on one wing of my house. All around me, the freshly fallen snow is undisturbed. But in that one little corner of the roof, I can just make out a pair of imprints marring the scene. I probably don't have to describe them to you. My front door is maybe 30 feet away. 30 feet. I'm wondering if I should try sleeping in the car tonight.
Tragedy has struck the Grand Valley area as the bodies of 2 college students have been found dead at the KMSA radio station on Mesa State College's main campus.
It says 2 people. I've been alone in this booth for so long. When was the last time I went home? Well, in any case, let's continue with tonight's festivities. And now, 2-sentence horror stories. I was never a fan of eating while on an airplane, but we'd crashed 5 days ago and I was starving, so I started on my left leg. I was really scared of spending Halloween alone this year, but as I listened to the sobs from the trick-or-treaters in my basement, I smiled at the knowledge that my fears were unfounded. The water outside was peaceful. That's only because I couldn't get the car window to break. No kids came for Halloween tonight. I guess that means the bear traps worked. My phone call with my mom was interrupted by a knock on the door. Mouthing me to hang up was my mom. It took 5 minutes and a screwdriver, but the cap finally came loose with a satisfying pop. Now, for the other knee. I can hear 1 year into the future. Today, the noise stopped. He tortured me for over an hour, adding to my pain little by little, and then he did the one thing I thought one friend could never do to another. Uno. I forgot to grab something. I'll be right back, said Mom. As she rounded the corner, out of sight, the cashier began ringing up our groceries. Oh my God! Oh.
What's going on?
Oh, how long have you been here?
I don't know. I just came to just a little while ago.
Oh my God.
What's happening?
Oh, I'm doing my show right now.
Show?
I'm reading scary stories. Yeah, it's Halloween. You know, we're doing like a special.
Halloween?
Yeah. Wait,
What do you mean Halloween?
Who are you again? What's your name?
I don't remember at all. What's happening?
Wait, it's Jerry, right? Yeah, no, you're the guy that gave me the Dead by Dalen name. That's right.
Oh, yeah, that's right. I think.
What happened?
Look, it's kind of hard to explain. Like, I figured I'm so funny all the time outside of the radio station. I figured I'd try and do something serious when I got here, if that makes sense.
No, I get your show. It's just something's not adding up.
Yeah, you're telling me. I saw like a radio thing the other day, and it was talking about the station, but I don't know. I'm just trying to figure it out.
Wait, you said it's Halloween?
Yeah, it's Halloween. You know, October 31st, spooky time.
That doesn't make sense.
What do you mean?
The last thing I remember, we were in September.
What do you mean? It was. Wait. Well, thank you, Jerry. We really appreciate you coming down. Ladies and gentlemen, I need to figure out what's going on. Here's some music to keep you company.
I can see you from behind. You can hear me in your mind. Run so fast as you can go. Time will catch you before you of the dark? Are you scared? You know, I am you. I'm coming closer. I will catch you. The time it goes tick tock, tick tock, tick tock. Are you afraid of the dark? Are you scared? You know, I am you.
Imagine being fired because of who you love. Imagine being denied medical treatment because of who you marry. Imagine being evicted because of who you are. Millions of Americans don't have to imagine this. They have to live it. Because in 30 states, it's legal to discriminate against LGBT people. Get the facts at beyondido.org. Brought to you by the Gill Foundation and the Ad Council.
Darkness in the Rearview Mirror by Anonymous. I've always been uneasy driving alone at night. It was worse the first few times when I had just gotten my license, but the nagging fear has never gone away to this day. It's disorienting to look into the mirrors and see nothing, and I mean nothing, but the consuming blackness of the night. It makes me hesitant to check the mirrors should I see this dark void. Or worse, someone's sitting in my back seat, staring at me. In the summer of 2013, I found myself driving home alone on Highway 902 from a party. It was almost midnight, and needless to say, it was pitch black. As was usual at night, I was on edge. I had the radio off and could hear nothing but the muffled roar of tires on pavement and the dull hum of the engine. I stole a glance into the middle rearview mirror and saw nothing but darkness through the back window. I know that I looked backward and saw nothing. I'm sure of it. Just the seemingly endless blackness of the night. I remember it so clearly because not 10 seconds later, a car passed me to the left. Headlights on, I had one of those sudden adrenaline rushes like when you think you see a person outside your bedroom window when it's just a tree, or when you start awake at night with the feeling of falling. 10 seconds earlier, nothing had been behind me. Suddenly, a car. I drove all the way home shivering and knowing something was off. The next morning, I found 2 sets of scratches near the back of my van. One was on the left rear, one was on the right. The car was pretty old. They could have been there for months, but that was the first time that I distinctly remembered seeing them. In hindsight, there are two possibilities for what happened that night. Possibility one, by some glitch in reality or something paranormal, this other car had somehow appeared behind me within 10 seconds of me checking my mirror. Like some weird ghost stuff or something. However, the second option is what makes my blood run cold whenever I consider it. It didn't even occur to me until months after the fact, but it makes me dread driving alone at night even more. Possibility 2. The car was normal. It had approached me from the rear and passed me to the left. However, something large and wide and as black as the night had been clinging to the rear of my car, obscuring my view through the window and leaving deep scratches on the sides. And I had inadvertently driven it home with me. As we approach hour 2 of Dead Man Talking's Halloween special, so too do we continue chapter 2 of My Romantic Cabin Getaway by Felix Blackwell. I'm sorry for the delay, everyone. We are collecting ourselves. Sorry for any formatting issues. I'm writing this on my phone. Faye's dad picked us up in his truck. He brought his buddy with him, who is now following us in my car. A lot of things happened last night. Some things I won't share because I'm not sure how to interpret them yet. I'm not even sure I understand what happened. But here are the most important things. I also managed to get some recordings, which I'll try to upload when we get home to California in a few days. I tried to stay awake last night until 1 a.m. because over the past few nights, that is the approximate time that the noises change from rustling and branches cracking to voices. I didn't make it. I fell asleep on the couch with my laptop open, waiting for the Wi-Fi to come back. I think this was at about 12:30 a.m. I woke up right around 1:15 a.m. to a muffled voice. In my sleepy days, I struggled to figure out where it was coming from. I thought it was just outside the living room window, so I sat there quietly trying to make the words out. It was a woman's voice and said things like, "A few days. It's not mine. I'm not alone. Okay." I got up and peeked out the curtains and didn't see anyone. But then the voice said, "It's my parents' house." And I knew the voice was Faye's. As I mentioned earlier, my fiancée has an undiagnosed sleep disorder and has extensive sleep talk and sometimes sleepwalks. She's had pronounced night terrors since she was a little kid. I'll post a story on that someday. I walked into the bedroom to find Faye, sleeping on her tummy as usual. She didn't say anything else as I came in. Two things really disturbed me about this situation, though. The first is that she appeared to be having a conversation with someone, which is actually quite common for her. But the person she was conversing with was interrogating her, asking her questions about herself, me, the cabin, etc. Second, in her sleep, Faye was imitating another voice. It wasn't hers that she was speaking with. She was altering the pitch and tone to sound like a different person. My modus operandi is to not wake her up when she has sleep disturbances. There's a story behind this. Expect one someday. Instead, I gently rub her back and hair, which calms her and puts her back to restful sleep. I did this for a few minutes, but then there was another noise off in the distance, outside. I got up and walked to the window to listen, and I think this was the first time that I felt really scared enough that I felt that we were in real danger. It was a child singing in the dark. I couldn't really make out much of what he or she was saying, but I am certain that it was a child, probably aged 6 to 8, trying to sing a song. The snow had abated for a while now, and the stars were notably bright, so I could see all the way to the rim of the forest, about 20 yards out. There was a figure standing there just past the first trees, back facing me, looking up at either the moon or the tops of the trees. It stood so still that I convinced myself it was just a tree stump or something, and in a few minutes, it was no longer visible. My skeptical nature compels me to be reasonable and say my eyes were just playing tricks on me. When I turned around, Faye was sitting straight up in bed, eyes closed. She does this a lot in her sleep. She craned her neck and said something like, "Don't let them in," or "Don't let him inside." She was still doing the weird voice, so I woke her up. Faye and I sat in the bedroom with the lights on, talking about what we should do. I tried to get online and send an email to her parents, but of course, it doesn't work when you need it. We agreed to stay in the same room and try to fall back asleep. At one point, I got up to get her some water. She hadn't vomited in several hours now and was feeling a lot better. And out of the kitchen window, I saw flashes of pale light. They weren't like the flashes you'd see when someone walks through the woods with a flashlight. They were more like if someone had a lantern and they could slowly turn it on and off. I flicked on the porch lights to the front and sides of the house, hoping that it would discourage anyone from trying to approach. But as I walked back to the bedroom, I saw the distinct outline of a person through the window curtain in the living room. They were pressed against the glass with their hands on it, trying to peer inside. Since it was dark in the living room and bright outside, I could clearly see their silhouette. I shouted and approached the window, but the person ran off before I pulled the curtain open. Faye slept soundly, but I continued to hear voices outside. Different ones, on and off all night until dawn. I wrote several of them down. I couldn't sleep, so I camped out in the living room. I kept the bedroom door open so I could hear Faye if she started talking again. The voices would go away for hours and then start back up again. At one point, I fell asleep because I was awoken by the sound of a light switch flicking on and off. From the couch, I could see light from outside going on and off in patterns of 5. I can't explain why this disturbed me so much, but it did. And I imagined some kind of horrible creature standing in my house somewhere, flipping the switch up and down and smiling. My first instinct was to check on Faye, and I nearly had a heart attack when I saw that she wasn't in bed. I started calling her name and pacing around the house, looking out the windows to see if she was outside. When I looked out the kitchen window, there she was, sitting on the hood of my car, about 30 feet out in the driveway. Her back was to me, and she was staring off into the forest. She was absolutely rigid, just the way she sits up in bed when she's asleep. Faye has sleepwalked all over the house back home in California. I've found her in many different areas, in the kitchen and the downstairs hallway and the living room, but she's never gone outside. I shouted her name from the kitchen, but the second I did, Faye jumped off my car and dashed into the woods at full sprint. She never looked back at me. I started flipping out and screaming her name over and over. I scrambled to grab my boots to go after her, but the second I pulled the front door open, Faye called out my name from behind. She was standing in the hall, looking confused, asking me what was wrong. Apparently, she had been in the bathroom. In my masculine crusade, I'd forgotten to check there. I looked out at my car and into the forest, and honestly, the first thought that came to my mind was, very clever. Needless to say, we stayed up the remaining few hours until dawn, intermittently writing down the voices we heard, which faded away and became less frequent with the passage of time. I'll try to get the recordings up in a few days. For now, here is that list of voices we heard. We recalled just some of the voices from the previous nights from memory, but I just figured you'd like to know what was being said throughout the duration of this lovely cabin experience. I will return to Colorado, but forget Pikes Peak. A man's voice, vaguely familiar but couldn't put a face to it, over the past several nights. Hello? Oh God, look at it. Look. Hello? Don't. They see in the dark. I'm lost. What you, whoa. My. It's very dark. I see those lights. I'll come down there. Don't smile. I see you. A woman's voice, sounded aged 20-ish. Gasps in horror and surprise over and over. Lay it on the ground and burn it. La 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 La, 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 la. She talks in her sleep. She's talking to me now. A child, sounded about 6 to 8 years old, indeterminate gender. Crying and whining, occasional laughter. Oh, sol mi adu, why do I do? Eat, eat, eat. I am a vacant soul, mi adu. They were singing this. Not sure if this is actually English or if my mind is just forcing the sounds into English. When do we go inside? When do we go inside? The voice of my mother from a few nights ago. Stop! Look at the windows. Did you see it? The voice of Faye's grandfather a few nights ago. Lots of indiscernible groaning, calls for help. Something about the war. Faye's body's still in the ground here. Never found them, but they're here. Right here. Right here. Ooh, they found it. They found it. Oh, I'm standing in the same place. 20 years. By the way, I forgot to check to see if that dream catcher was still out there. In the back. You're welcome to drive out there and look for yourself, though.
I can't believe he found them.
He seems sorry.
We very clearly told him not to look up there.
I'm honestly impressed that he was able to do it.
Right? What, did he balance on that big chair?
Yeah, I mean, I guess he'll just know what his gifts are this year.
I really thought we had hidden them well.
If they can find their presents, they can find a gun.
911, what is your emergency?
Every day, 8 kids and teens are unintentionally killed or injured by loaded and unlocked guns. Learn how to make your home safer at endfamilyfire.org. Brought to you by the Ad Council and End Family Fire.
Tragedy has struck the Grand Valley area as the bodies of 2 college students have been found dead at the KMSA radio station on Mesa State College's main campus. Police have yet to identify the 2 students due to horrible mutilation. This is truly a sad day for us at Mesa State. Police are issuing an emergency curfew effective immediately until the persons involved are captured. I repeat, the murderer is still at large, highly likely armed.
Big updates in the Grand Valley area. Mesa State College has been shut down since the horrific murder of 2 college students in October of 1999.
Wait, what? 1999? That's odd. KMSA's been going strong for the last 20 years. I'm not sure where these articles keep coming from, but they won't stop us from reading about the things that go bump in the night. I hope you're all enjoying your Halloween night so far. We have only a little while longer before November is upon us. One Last Trick or Treat by L. Chan. It's that time of the year again. I know how I'm going to be spending Halloween. Same way I have for the past 2 years, slowly nursing a beer in the bar, watching the glass sweat on that smooth wooden counter, staring at it till it goes warm in my hand. I'm not there to get drunk. I'm there to escape. I never want to be alone at home over Halloween again. I promised the deputy that I wouldn't talk about that night. The town didn't need it. Heck, I even deleted the video. But now, with Halloween around the corner, it all comes back. Well, small town law enforcement doesn't care too much about the internet. I live in a small house at the end of the lane, another nondescript house down a row of its sisters. Prefabricated mostly, far enough off the beaten path to be cheap, not so far as to be rural, but close, pretty close. I didn't expect many kids to call around trick-or-treating come Halloween. It's a long road, and most children manage to fill their baskets long before they get to my place. Besides, I quite like the peace and quiet. Halloween used to be a good night to settle down and catch some of the classic horror movies on TV. I kept a couple of bags of candy around just in case some kids actually made it all the way down the lane, but mostly it would be an evening all to myself. I can't quite remember what I was watching that night. Probably because I'd been enjoying an after-dinner beer and I may have gotten carried away, dozing off after one too many. I woke with a start. My beer had gone warm on the side table, my hand still curled around the can. I winced as I unwrapped my fingers. Something had woken me up. The TV droned on in the background, the senseless drivel of late-night programming flickering across the room. Maybe it was just some high school kids out after some Halloween party, out on the streets making some noise that woke me up. I checked the time. Past midnight. I was glad that I'd invested in a little security for my house. Just the basics, really. A good camera to cover my front lawn, motion-activated lights around the front and back. I was trying to make the tough decision of whether to clear up the mess right there and then, or to just kick the can down the road till the next morning, when a loud rapping at the door shattered the silence. The can bounced off the floor, warming beer spraying across the bottom of my track pants. The shock left me too numb even to swear. I had just set the can back upright when the knocking sounded again. That arrhythmic rap increasingly impatient, the tempo building up as I stepped towards the door. I peered around the edge of the window and saw nothing but my pale face in the glass. It was pitch dark outside. Why wasn't the light working? The knocking stopped. A tree branch, perhaps, or something else tapping on the porch. The peephole glared at me, that little glass orb suddenly bulging with some half-promised horror. I swallowed, or I tried. My throat was dry, the warm beer on the floor suddenly inviting. "It's nothing," I said out loud, hoping that the familiar echo of my voice off the walls would ground me somehow. I walked up to the door and peered out, only seeing the orange cones cast by the halogen streetlights, a distance away. Nothing, I thought to myself, feeling childishly stupid. I sucked in a deep breath and felt my lungs strain, then let the air stream out slowly. Then, another knock. I turned back around to face the door. My heart punched at the inside of my chest, its crazed dance playing counterpoint to the knocking. I wasn't surprised to see my hand shake as I reached for the doorknob. Our town was a safe one, far from the troubles of the big cities. Or so we read in the newspapers. We had little more to fear in the night than seeing our trash strewn across the yard by the nimble fingers of raccoons. I threw the door open. The porch lights winked on and suddenly blinding me. I blinked away the white spots from my vision. A pair of children stood on my porch. They must have been 9 or 10. I couldn't see much more of them because they were in the classic Halloween getup. A simple sheet draped over each of them, a pair of holes cut for them to see through. A pair of small baskets for candy broke the smooth lines of the sheets. The toes of the brand new dress shoes peeked out from under the sheets. A boy and a girl, I thought. Trick or treat. Such a common refrain. I'd expected the words, but not the delivery. There were but 2 figures in front of me, yet their voices seemed to come from a great distance away. Trick or treat. The pair spoke again. I felt a little discomfited at the distortion of their voices. More than the weird volume, their voices seemed to blend into each other's with some strange harmonics at play at the edges. It seemed almost as if there was a choir of 2, just there, speaking to me. Treat, I guess, I said. More than anything, I wanted those 2 away from my house. The whole situation felt wrong. The familiar veneer of the season concealing something deeper, something rotten. Like that small panic when biting into a fruit and feeling that lack of resistance, your teeth sinking into soft mush instead of sweet flesh. For a moment, I blamed the haze of alcohol, the dregs of sleep clouding my judgment, but adrenaline had swept those far away. My fear was true. I turned to the counter where I kept my keys and grabbed for the bag of candy I had prepared for the occasion. I was half hoping that the 2 figures would be gone when I returned to the door, that they'd been a figment of my imagination, perhaps a shadow of some dream brought on by cheap horror movies and cold pizza. I had no such luck. The pair hadn't moved an inch. They each raised their baskets, There was already an assortment of candy there. They'd had a good day. It's a bit late for you guys to be out, isn't it? Where are your parents? The only answer I got was an impatient shaking of the baskets, the rasp of candy wrappers rustling. I held out a handful of candy, ready to drop it and call it a night. I expected to see a small, pale hand clutching at the handle of the basket. Instead, I saw the anemic matte sheen of plastic. The basket was draped off the plastic hand of some kind of store mannequin. I was more than thoroughly creeped out by this effective little trick. I shrugged. Maybe the voices were recorded, a little technology to bolster an otherwise traditional costume. I felt the fear melting away as I explained it to myself in my head. Just some clever little children, probably with the help of an adult. Smart, I thought. It had certainly got me going for a while. Stay safe, I told them, dropping the last of the candy into the baskets. They didn't acknowledge me. They just stood still on the worn wooden boards of my porch. I shut the door on them. The window darkened as the light on the porch shut off. Odd. Maybe the motion detection stopped working. Some unbidden instinct told me to stay there and wait. I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the porch as the two walked off. Still, the light stayed dark. My relief grew as the odd strangers left my property. Still, something didn't sit right. Something wasn't right. The light was working. It turned on when it detected me. It saw me. It didn't see the kids. The sensor was working. It was state-of-the-art. Passive infrared, detected motion by detecting changes in temperature, like a human body. Like mine, but not the kids's. Whatever was under those pristine white sheets wasn't warm at all. The realization washed over me, like an ice cube running down my spine. My breath came in short rasps. I had to see. I had to know. I could barely bring my hand to the curtains. They were shaking so bad. When I pinched the edge of the curtain between my thumb and finger, the curtain began to undulate widely. I filled my lungs and peered out through the glass. They were still there, barely 20 yards away, doing nothing. Just standing there, motionless, facing the street. As I watched, they both swiveled their heads in perfect tandem to affix two pairs of fathomless eye holes on the window. There was no way. There was no way they could have seen me come to the window. I had to put the back of my hand in my mouth and bite down hard to keep from calling out. They knew. They knew I was there. I backed away from the window, dragging my leaden feet over the carpeted floor. I barely noticed when my heel knocked the can back. The beer leaked out onto the carpet, leaving a widening patch in front of me. I couldn't believe the raw, animal fear those two had summoned up in me. Every instinct I had told me to run. Run. Get help. Anything but stay and be trapped in my own house. What could I do? Call the police and tell them that I was scared of two little children trick-or-treating? Call one of my friends past midnight and ask them to come over like a little boy crawling to his parents' room after a nightmare? The situation was ridiculous. My mind told me so. That there had to be a rational explanation for everything. But I could not explain away the light, fluttering feeling in my stomach. I could not rationalize the prickly lump at the back of my throat. They'd only said 3 words to me in those unearthly tones. Who knew how cold those lips were? I shut the door to the kitchen, the sound echoing through the empty house. I turned my chair to face the front door, and then I walked, white-knuckled, for the dawn to come. I must have fallen asleep sometime during that long, cold wait. Not daring to move from my chair, paralyzed with fear that one of those shrouded children would appear at my window, or worse yet, behind me. But even that manic store of energy wore out as the night wound to a close. I was woken up by a polite knock on the front door. I sat bolt upright, nearly falling off my chair. I stumbled to the door, a hint of the dread from a few hours ago still lingering like a stale funk in the air. I checked the peephole again. This time, I was confronted with the well-scrubbed face of one of our town deputies. We'd been to school together. It was that kind of smallish town where you'd know almost everybody your age if they had a history there. He was an earnest man, tough, but fair. Good morning, officer. Good morning, he replied. The sour look on his face told me that it was anything but that. His nose twitched as he took in the stale, sour smell of beer steaming off the floor in the morning sun. Had a good night last night? I thought back to the night before. No, I didn't. The lawman was quick to see the fleeting shadow of doubt wash across my face. He pressed home his advantage. You care to explain why you stole the 2 mannequins from the store, dressed them up, and put them in your lawn? He shifted to the side, and past his door-filling bulk, I saw 2 familiar shapes on my lawn. My lungs wouldn't fill with air. They were still there. They'd been there the whole time. You okay, buddy? The big man leaned in, blocking my view, and steadied my shoulder with one of his strong hands. I brushed his hand off and lurched out into the yard, mindless of the freezing dew on my bare feet. The pair stood there, the draped sheets joining between them. They were holding hands. The 2 of them were holding hands. I brought my palm down gingerly on the head of the one nearer to me. Hard. I felt hard plastic. I whipped the sheet off with one smooth motion. I gave a strangled cry as I stared into the empty green eyes of a child mannequin. I backed away. Too quick. I ended up on my butt in the cold grass, clawing and scrambling backwards until I bumped into the solid legs of the deputy behind me. He'd been quick to recognize my unease earlier. He was just as quick to realize genuine fear. He hoisted me back to my feet and helped me back into my house. Mind telling me what that was all about? He dumped me on the police office chair in front of my computer. I tried, but I couldn't force the words out. The deputy sighed and settled onto my couch, wrinkling his nose at the empty beer cans on the side table. He leaned forward. First call of the morning after Halloween, and I'm chasing down some stupid break-in to a store in the middle of town. Now I've got you hungover and scared from a pair of dolls on your front yard. What I know is someone got into a store, smashed up the glass, stole sheets and a couple of mannequins. Kids again. Except the glass. The lines on his brow deepened. I watched his Adam's apple bob up and down. The glass on the door was outside of the shop only. Darndest thing. You got a camera on your yard, don't you? I nodded, numbly. What say you give me another 10 minutes of your time, tops? We'll go through the footage. I see who put those things on your lawn, and then I'll be out of your life. Hopefully for good. I turned to face my computer and called up the stored videos on my hard drive. They were all transferred by Wi-Fi, convenient for the time that I bought the cameras. Just put on double speed backwards, and we'll see who set them there soon enough. I hit the reverse play key and upped the speed. I saw the 2 of us scuttle from the house to the lawn and back again. Then the first rays of the sun retreating from the grass, pulling back over the pair of figures, until they were back in the darkness. The 2 of them stood there, motionless, for the longest time. When the 2 figures moved, all by themselves, in a jerky, swaying motion back from my lawn to my front door, the cursor danced a little jig in the corner of the screen as the shakes returned, stronger than before. The sharp hiss behind me told me I wasn't alone in my discomfort. I shuddered as I watched myself on screen, so close to the 2 abominations, giving them a handful of candy each. I slowed the recording back to normal speed. On screen, I saw myself turn back into the house to retrieve the candy. The 2 figures stood there, impassive. As one, they both fixed those dark eye holes on the sheets, on the camera. There was something else unmistakable. There was a slight pulse in the sheets, a small undulation. The mannequins were breathing. Yeah, I've seen enough. I turned to look at the deputy, his face as white as the sheets on the shrouded figures on that screen, his hand tight around the grip of his sidearm. That, of all the things, scared me most of all. A symbol of law and order who had seen the worst of what our little community had to offer, just as scared as I was and ready to pull a gun in my house. I clicked the window shut and got up. I wandered over to my cabinet. I pulled out a pair of tumblers and a bottle of the good stuff. The bottle gave me a couple of
contented glugs as I sloshed the rich golden whiskey into the glasses. I set one down in front of the other man and took a sip from my glass. A lawman could lose his job drinking on duty. The deputy didn't hesitate when he emptied half of his glass. He didn't look at me when he spoke. My old nan wasn't from around here. She was back from the old country, across the sea. She hated Halloween. Said there were things out there at night that weren't meant to see the light of day. One night a year, she told me, for one single night, some things were set loose. Candy and costumes were a new thing. Back in the past, on All Hallows Eve, good folk crossed themselves and prayed and stayed in. Whatever's on that recording, it's not what our town needs. You understand? Dumb high school kids, I said, the lie taking shape and form in my mouth, fooling around. The lie fleshed out, took on a veneer of credibility. That would be the explanation. No one had to know the dark kernel of that story. And your camera, it was having technical difficulties that night. Never was a good piece of equipment. Regretted buying it the same week. He stuck out his hand, and we shook on it. And I have kept my word to now. There isn't a good reason why I broke my promise. I'd never known true fear till that night, but I replay it in my head over and over. The recording is long gone, of course, but every detail of that night has been branded on my mind. I don't remember the fear, but I cannot think of a single action the two of them had done to threaten me. Eerie, unnatural, but without a drop of malice. It'll be Halloween soon. I know where I'll be on that dark night. Some things roam the streets that shouldn't be there. The masks and costumes aren't always for the children. Sometimes they're there for the adults. For our own protection. After the deputy left, I watched the video, forwards, just once. I remember seeing the two figures on my lawn, slowly inching their hands up, locking under the sheets, and waiting for the sun to rise. Things that shouldn't be out on this good earth, but sometimes, just sometimes, they want the simple things, like one last trick-or-treat. Have you ever been to Bunnyman Bridge by Sherman Smith? Dude, you've never been to Bunnyman Bridge? You've never even heard of it? I'd been living in Virginia for less than 6 months when my buddy Scott asked me this question. I was a recent transplant from New Jersey and had no idea what he was talking about. We were sitting on the lawn outside of the house we rented together, tossing back beers in the brisk evening air. No, I said. What's that? Well, back in the 70s, some kids were out by this bridge in Clifton, right? They parked near this bridge, underpass thing. Looking to mess around, I guess, guy and a girl. Anyway, they park, and before they can even turn off the car, Scott's left fist smacked into his right palm. Bam! The window shatters. Crazy dude, dressed like a bunny, full bunny suit, ears and all, standing there, hatchet in hand. He had smashed out their window, warns them to leave and never come back. And they get out of there, right? Tell the cops. The psycho threw the hatchet at them or something because they had it with them. Cops never found anything. They'd find corpses out there like every year after that. That's crazy, I said. It sounded tame compared to the stories we told and retold growing up. New Jersey is a messed up place. That was Halloween night. If you go out there on Halloween, the bunny man comes out and tries to chop you up. No, Scott. I finished my beer and put the empty can down on the Debbie grass. We are not going out there. Not going out there. Yeah, we're going out there, he said, completely ignoring me. We gotta. It's awesome. I sighed. You can't talk Scott out of doing stupid things. Ask any of the emergency room doctors that have stitched him back together over the years. Fine, we'll go. Scott was like a kid on Christmas Eve. It was 2 weeks before Halloween, and I figured he'd get drunk and forget all about it. I was wrong.
Halloween crept up on me, and that entire day, Scott wouldn't stop going on and on about our trip to Bunnyman Bridge. He filled the tank with gas in his Jeep, bought snacks, even paid for some decent things to smoke on the way out there. At this point, I'd be mean if I said no, so off we went. The drive from Norfolk to Clinton took a little over 3.5 hours. We were going way out there. It's a tiny place, lots of historical significance, not even 300 people living there full time. The bridge was outside of town, on a back road near some old homes. I didn't believe for a minute that a crazy killer in a bunny costume would be wandering around at midnight. It had been almost 45 years since the story first popped up, but I do believe in being prepared. I'd been in the habit of carrying a small pistol with me everywhere I went since moving to the state. I wasn't stupid enough to leave it at home. We weren't trespassing, so I wasn't afraid of getting in trouble. I have my concealed carry permit. Better than safe than sorry, right? We rolled through the old town before midnight and made our way to the outskirts. During the day, I'm sure it would be a beautiful place to visit. Old churches, a steam locomotive parked on the tracks, a true throwback to the idyllic Americana of 60 years ago. At night, the tall peaks on the buildings cast odd, angular shadows against the ground, elongated by the light of the full moon. There were no street lamps or any kind of electric light. Most of the buildings we passed were dark. Once we drove through town and onto the back roads, it was even worse. Dense treetops bowed out over the road, blocking the moon for the majority of the drive. The headlights fought to pierce the thick fog covering the roadway. Scott couldn't have picked a better night to come out here. I'm not easy to scare, but my palms were starting to sweat a little. The hair on my forearms was on end, sending tiny pinpricks of electricity up my spine every time they brushed the interior of the car. Despite the balmy weather, I felt a chill creep along my skin. We rode in silence for the better part of the trip before Scott pulled over and parked. He turned to face me, looking me in the eye, and he grinned. "We're here." Without breaking eye contact, he killed the headlights and turned off the engine. The world descended into darkness, an inky black nothing that swallowed us up. Without the thrum of the old Jeep's engine, it was as quiet as a grave. The sudden silence left my ears ringing. So, we drove all the way out here. Now what? I looked out the window, squinting, trying to see. The scant moonlight that cut through the canopy of leaves didn't illuminate much. "We walked to the bridge." Scott didn't wait for me to respond. He got out of the car and closed his door. He began walking down the road, not looking back. I wasn't about to let him wander off without me. Scott is a disaster waiting to happen, and I didn't feel like spending my evening with him in the ER again. I jumped out of the Jeep and followed him. The road meandered through the thick trees for a few hundred yards before coming to a tight curve. We walked through the still night, side by side. Rounding the bend in the road, we reached an area where the tree cover was thinner and the moonlight broke through. The crowd narrowed into a concrete tube cutting through a small raised embankment. It was too dark to see the top of the elevated roadway. In the waning moonlight, the tunnel was little more than a yawning black opening, flanked in pale gray concrete. "Bunnyman Bridge," Scott said with a sense of triumph in his voice. He took out his phone and turned to face me. Leave it to this idiot to take a selfie at a time like this, I thought. He made a stupid face, moved the phone around to line up the photo, and pressed the screen. As he did, I noticed movement near the tunnel. At first I thought I was seeing things, but then I saw it again. From the bushes on the side of the structure, a tall, white form emerged. Scott saw the look on my face and spun around, phone in hand. The flashlight on his iPhone came on and lit up the roadway. Standing there, in front of the gaping black maw of the underpass, was a man in a bunny suit, well over 6 feet tall and gangly, all limbs and no mass. There was a yellow and red fire axe gripped in his hands. The long, slender ears of the bunny suit swayed behind him as he slowly made his way towards us. Dark patches stained the front of his suit. I didn't need to stretch my imagination to figure out what it was. Blood. Scott stammered and backpedaled into me. Without thinking, I reached behind me and removed my compact pistol from its holster. I pointed the gun at the approaching form and leveled the tritium sights on center mass. "Back up," I tried to sound commanding, but even I could hear the warble in my voice. "I'll shoot you, I swear." "Leave," he said. The bunny man didn't stop. He continued moving towards us, closing the gap. The axe swayed back and forth in front of him, and as he neared, I could see there was blood on the blade. I told myself to be rational. This was obviously a guy playing a prank on Halloween. He was trying to scare some idiots who came to see the bridge. But most people would drop that act in a heartbeat when there was a loaded gun pointed at them. He kept coming. The movement was slow, but he kept pacing towards us. I couldn't see his face in the deep shadows, but I could tell. I knew that he was staring at me. He pivoted and ran full bore towards Scott. I didn't hesitate. I exhaled, relaxed my arms, and squeezed the trigger, gently. The recoil shook my already strained muscles. The bunny man staggered, slowed, and slumped down into the roadway. He'd only moved a few dozen feet from the mouth of the tunnel to where he now sat. The scent of cordite tainted the cool night air. Crimson oozed from the front of his suit and joined the darker brown patch already there. The axe slipped from his grip, making a dull clunk on the asphalt. Scott stammered, mouth moving like a dying fish. He turned and ran back towards the Jeep. I kept the gun trained on the man and approached with caution. The bullet had struck him in the chest, but not in the heart. Still, I wasn't sure he wasn't going to last long. I moved to the side, kicking the axe away from him. "Scott, called the police!" I yelled. He didn't respond. I let go of the gun with my left and reached for my phone. My right hand, still holding my pistol, betrayed my frayed nerves. It vibrated at the end of my arm. The man coughed and sputtered, blood splattering his lips. "Please," he choked out. He reached for his midsection. I assumed he was going to put his hand to the wound, but it disappeared into a pouch on the front of the bunny suit. I hadn't noticed it due to the huge dark smear across the front. His hand came out holding a furry, black object. A rabbit, neck broken and head hanging limply to the side. He reached his arm as far forward as he could, which wasn't far, and tried to fling it to his side, back toward the tunnel opening. It landed 2 feet away with a sickening thud. He looked me in the eye. For the first time, I really took in his features. He was young, my age, younger even. Clean cut. I don't know what I was expecting. Crazy eyes, maybe? Homeless drifter meth mouth? I'm not sure. But it wasn't this. "Please." He coughed out again, motioning towards the rabbit. He opened his mouth to speak, but all that came out was a pained cry, followed by a wheezing, gurgling sound. I had hit him in the lung. I stared at the rabbit, trying to understand the situation. I was in shock looking back on it. You never know how you're going to react to the messed up situations life throws at you until you're there. That was the first time I paid attention to my surroundings since I initially saw him. The moon had shifted and I could see the opening of the tunnel now, and the large black fingers splayed on either side of the concrete. The opening was at least 12 feet wide, and somehow these hands were grabbing both sides at once. Hands that had to be a foot long, easy. 2 tiny red orbs danced in the darkness, the light refracting and giving them an odd, pale glow. That's when I first heard the scratching. Slow, like the labored dragging of heavy furniture across the ancient wooden floor, followed by a ticking, tapping sound. The bunny man heard it too. His eyes grew wide, his mouth trembling. He attempted to speak, but all that came out was a wet, rattling cough. He fell over trying to reach for the rabbit. I'm not sure why I didn't run for the Jeep. I sincerely wish I had. Phone and gun forgotten, I grabbed the rabbit carcass. It was still warm. I threw it, with everything I had left in me, into the dark opening. The silence grew palpable, and the tapered shadow figures retreated into the tunnel. I heard a sickening crunch. The dragging started again, retreating into the depths of the darkness. I looked at the bunny man laying on the ground, laboring to breathe. His face relaxed and he smiled. His unfocused eyes locked on mine, and he looked relieved. Your problem now, he said, then laughed. The laugh turned into a gurgling, choking noise, and then he laid still. I walked to Scott's truck and found him curled up on the floor in the back seat crying. I regained my senses enough to call the police at this point. They came out, took our statements and my pistol, and they held us for a while. The bunny man was a student who had been living in the area. We didn't find out much else. They found 2 more dead bunnies in the pocket of his outfit. They determined I had fired in self-defense and I wasn't charged with any crime. Scott never asked to go to the Bunny Man Bridge again. He moved out a few months later, and I haven't spoken to him since. Time went by. My therapist told me that I imagined the thing in the tunnel, that it was my way of coping with killing a man who intended to do harm to me and my friend. I began to believe it. October came again, and Halloween passed without incident. I was curious, though, about why I never heard anyone talk about the real Bunny Man after what happened. You'd think that would add to the legend, but I never saw it mentioned anywhere online or in the news. I was reading a forum post about local Virginia legends when the Bunny Man Bridge came up. Most people regurgitated the same old tales about escaped convicts and supernatural rabbits. But one person posted something that chilled my blood. They found another corpse this year, eaten. Hasn't happened in 5, maybe 6 years. The Bunny Man must be gone. Cold crept up my spine. The Bunny Man must be gone. I could hear the sickening crunch of that thing eating the rabbit. Corpses. Eaten. Your problem. It took me a while to come to terms with what happened. I've spent the better part of this year driving to Clifton and walking through the tunnel during the day. I want to know every inch of that road before October. Nobody is going to die this year. I've already purchased a bunny suit and an axe. I'm not sure where to get the rabbits from, but I have time. After all, it's only August. The Man in My Bedroom Window by Colin Entman. For as long as I can remember, there has been a man in my bedroom window. It seems strange to say, I know, but it's true. From the earliest, fuzziest memories I have, all the way up to now, he's been there, looking at me. In my first memories of him, he was an indistinct, blurry blob that was only vaguely man-shaped. My young mind didn't think much of it and hardly put much effort into understanding it. The man had always been there, standing motionlessly aside from a slight swaying motion that could have been a trick of the light. He didn't really do anything, and his presence hardly gave off any sort of threatening vibes. He was simply just a constant, passive presence in my life, much like the sun or moon. I simply accepted the fact that he was just always there. It wasn't until I was 7 years old that I realized his presence wasn't a normal thing when, for the very first time, he moved. I didn't really notice it at first as I wandered sleepily into my room that night. I quickly changed into my pajamas and settled into bed as usual. I made a point to not look at the window at all during this process. I was plenty used to the man's constant presence, but the idea of him watching me change still made me a bit uncomfortable. It helped to simply pretend he wasn't there as I got ready for bed. As soon as I was all snuggled up in bed, though, I would turn to face the window to say goodnight, much like how other young children might say goodnight to the moon. It was then that I saw his unusually indistinct hand, which suddenly seemed a lot more solid as it pressed firmly into the glass, causing the frame to creak under the pressure. Obviously startled by this, I rushed off to tell my parents. The looks on their faces when I told them that the man in my window moved were confused at first, then noticeably horrified. They rushed to my room, my mom carrying me along in her arms. When we got there, the man had returned to his usual position, standing motionless outside the window. When I tried to explain to my parents that, despite being back to normal, the man had definitely moved, they gave me a strange sort of look. However, a flash of understanding passed across my dad's face, and he leaned in to whisper something into my mom's ear. She nodded in response, and they both signed in visible relief. I continued to try and frantically explain, but she just gently shushed me as she laid me back down into bed. I still clearly remember what she said to me as she tucked me in that night. "It's okay, honey. You just had a bad dream. there's no man standing in your window. It took a couple of years, a few trips to a psychologist, and more than a few unpleasant encounters with kids at school, however. Eventually, I learned to not talk about the man in my window. I learned that telling others about it would hardly do me any good, as there wasn't exactly anything I could do to prove that he existed. Nobody but I could see him, and there was no way of physically interacting with him. He didn't actually exist on the other side of the window. It was more like he was a reflection, or some kind of image projected directly onto the window. Left with little else to do, I simply shut up about it. Eventually, after some time, everyone else in my life simply forgot about it, passing the whole thing off as just some odd childhood behavior. I never forgot, though, of course, and I definitely never stopped seeing him. I did some research, of course, to try and figure out what the man in my window was. The best guess I could come up with was that he was a ghost or spirit of some kind, mostly because it was the only option I could find that made much of any sense. However, I couldn't seem to find any information on any other instances of someone experiencing a similar situation. None of the somewhat dubious methods of either communicating with or getting rid of the man had worked either, so I eventually just gave up and went back to ignoring him for the most part. It wasn't like worrying about his completely passive, non-aggressive existence in my life would do any sort of good anyway. Things would go on like this for quite a while. Years passed, and my family moved to a new house and a new state in my high school years. I had entertained the possibility that the man might disappear or be left behind as a result of our move, but I wasn't particularly disheartened to find him residing within my new bedroom window the first night after our move. Eventually, I moved away for college and into the on-campus dorm. The man followed me there as well. College would eventually come to an end, and shortly after, I moved into my current apartment. At this point, I would have been more surprised if the man hadn't followed me there. Over the years, his constant presence would be unchanging. However, there was something about the man that was slowly starting to change over time. I thought that it was just my imagination at first. However, it slowly became clear that this wasn't the case. As time went on, the man was steadily becoming more and more clear and distinct. Much like hair growth, it was very slow going, but became more obvious over time. I began to be able to make out certain details about his appearance, the length and general shape of his hair, the color of his clothes, things like that. As of late, I've been able to somewhat make out the style of the clothes he's wearing as well. Plaid, button-up, and a pair of jeans, to be specific. Despite this, for the longest time, I wasn't able to make out any of his facial features. No matter how clear the rest of him would become, his face would still remain as stubbornly blurry and indistinct as my earlier memories of him. Other than that, though, it seemed like nothing much else changed and that things would simply go on as normal. That is, until last night. In the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of banging. It was a desperate sort of racket, as if whoever was doing it was trying their very best to make as much noise as possible. I thought at first that it was someone at my front door, but I quickly realized that it wasn't the case. The sound was much too close for that. I turned my gaze to the bedroom window and realized that it was him, the man in my window. I recoiled in fear, terrified by his sudden violence. It was the most I'd ever seen the man move, and certainly the most threatening he'd ever seemed. It took me a long moment of panicked breaths and adrenaline, but I eventually realized that he wasn't able to get in. Rather, it seemed more like the man wasn't even trying to, as if he was simply trying to get my attention. Having calmed down a bit, I decided to test this theory. I rose from my bed, putting on my glasses as I went, and drew closer to the window. Lo and behold, the man ceased his banging. His body language, however, was still panicked and fearful. I couldn't tell since I couldn't see his face, but it almost seemed as if he was trying to yell at me. However, he seemed incapable of speaking in a way I could hear, and I had no way of attempting to read his obscured lips. This quickly started to change, though. The man was clearer than he had ever been before, so clear that you could almost convince me that he was just a reflection. He was becoming even clearer by the second, and for the first time ever, I was beginning to be able to see his facial features. It started around the edges, giving me an idea of the general shape of his face. Then it started drawn closer towards the center of his face. The more it revealed, though, the more familiar the man became. So familiar that it was eerie. This familiarity shook me to my very core. I knew the man. It was me. And he was screaming, "Run."
Tragedy has struck the Grand Valley area as the bodies of 2 college students have been found dead at the KMSA radio station on Mesa State College's main campus. Police have yet to identify the 2 students due to horrible mutilation. This is truly a sad day for us at Mesa State. Police are issuing an emergency curfew effective immediately until the persons involved are captured. I repeat, the murderer is still at large, highly likely armed.
Big updates in the Grand Valley area. Mesa State College has been shut down since the horrific murder of 2 college students in October of 1999. Not going public with much information, MSC has revealed that they have decided to reopen under a new name, Colorado Mesa University. Hopefully, this can put some distance between the horrific actions taken place at the radio station just 12 years ago and the now university's reputation. From 91.3 FM, and have a safe and happy Halloween. Two kids murdered in a radio station. Jerry. Me. It's all coming together. As our show comes to an end, thank you for tuning in to the Halloween special of Dead Man Talking. I have been your host, Dead by Dalen. For more information on other shows through KMSA, go to kmsa913fm.com. For more information on this show and all the credits and music used, go to www.dolan.com/deadmantalking. That's www.dewlan.com/deadmantalking. Thank you. Thank you so much for tuning in. And until next time, sweet dreams.